Thank you very much, Thaddeus, and thank you very much, Dean Rutherford, and thank you for everyone for being here. I know it's not September 11th that you're all here for. I think Russia seems to be on a lot of people's minds, and I'm impressed how many people are here. So thanks for coming. At this point, if you ask most Americans, they would consider Russia devious. They would consider Russia the enemy right now. Russia hacked the US election. Russia is trying to destroy the West. President Putin is an evil puppet master who kills his enemies. Sadly, I would say more than any point since the Cold War, Russia has become the boogeyman. Now, some of that is true. Russia did hack the US election, according to the unanimous assessment of US intelligence. Putin's administration has been accused of targeting and killing its enemies. And Russia sees the United States not just as a rival, but an ideological opponent. At some point after the Cold War ended, after President Bush rebuffed President Putin after 9/11, after major protests in Russia in 2011, 2012, President Putin and the people around him decided that the United States was intent on subjugating Russia, on permanently keeping Russia weak. In the mind of Putin and the people around him who were versed in the Cold War, this is a zero-sum game. The world is either going to be dominated by the US, or it's going to be safe for authoritarianism. It's going to be safe for Putin's version of Russia. And as Russia overcame the chaos of the 1990s and the retrenchment of the 2000s, as Russia was trying to make the world a little safer for itself, it looked up and saw in the West something it hadn't seen before: vulnerability, ambivalence. And this is the story where it's not really that President Putin is the boogeyman and Russia is the boogeyman. The West had become ambivalent about the very liberal order of free trade and global alliances that we had created and that has kept our prosperity since 1945. President Putin did not create Brexit and the people who are talking about the dissolution of the United Kingdom 300 years later. President Putin did not send refugees fleeing sub-Saharan Africa and the horror of Syria into Europe. Largest exodus since World War II. It's helped tear at Europe's fabric. He did not inspire Marine Le Pen in France to predict the dissolution of the EU or force 10 million French to vote for her. He did not create manufacturing losses in the industrial Midwest or the alienation from government that many Americans feel. Putin did not create Donald Trump. The West has created its own divisions. Today's Russia exploits those divisions, and I think that's an important line. We have to understand why Russia exploits those divisions. Perhaps it's that ideological difference. Some people, frankly, in both Russia and the US, are still fighting the Cold War, an existential battle between a closed society and an open society. Perhaps Russia's goal is to weaken the West, weaken Western alliances, Western institutions, weaken the transatlantic bond. All of that is true. But all politics is local, and perhaps many of his motivations are actually domestic. We're going to talk about all of that. But I want to say that today might be the most dangerous point in US-Russia relations since the 1970s. There is no talk of integrating Russia politically or integrating Russia into the global financial system anymore. There's no talk of shrinking our mutual nuclear stockpiles. Russia and the West right now seem to be opposed to each other ideologically, fundamentally, and cannot figure out a way to work with each other. And I believe that that is dangerous. Even Russia's most vocal critics say that the US and Russia need to come a little closer together, or need to figure out a way to talk to each other. Perhaps it doesn't need repeating, but that is the case if for no other reason than these are the only two countries who have weapons pointed at each other who could reduce the other to ash multiple times over. It was Winston Churchill who described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, and that is the title, or that's where the title of today's talk comes from. So let's unwrap the mystery a little bit and see if we can't understand more about today's Russia, how it thinks, why it does what it does, and crucially, why Putin's popularity is largely legitimate. So let's talk about identity. Over the last decade and a half or so, the Putin government has helped create a new Russian identity. It's a combination of religion, old Russian traditions, and what we would call rediscovered nationalism. They wouldn't use that word, they would call it pride and patriotism that was once lost and has now been found. On religion first. More than 70% of Russians are Orthodox Christians. And under Putin, the church, the Orthodox Church, has been revitalized. New churches have been built, old churches have been remodeled, and the president himself goes out of his way to be seen as devout. And in return, faith is patriotic. Orthodox priests criticize so-called Western values, freedom of speech, gay rights, as heresies. And Orthodox priests bless Russian weapons. Literally, they actually bless Russian ICBMs. And they endorse Putin professionally and politically. As Father John, a priest in the southern Russian town of Krasnodar, told me this spring, quote, "The state and my faith are united. They can't be separated. The values of the church and the state coincide." So if today's re-energized Orthodox Church helps create pride in shared religion, reconstituting pre-Soviet symbols creates pride in shared traditions. And let's take one particularly fun example of those traditions and these symbols. 500 years ago, Cossacks were the Russian Tsar's henchmen. They were like cowboys to the US or samurai to the Japanese. Fierce horsemen, a whip-wielding irregular army that protected Russian Empire's borders. They were celebrated not because they adhered to the rule of law, but in fact, they lived above it. They answered to the higher authority of code, tradition, and honor. The Soviet Union persecuted them. Putin's Russia restored them and tried to tap into their imperial role, which is an important word. Today's Cossacks are kind of like the Kremlin's henchmen, willing and able to do things that the police aren't allowed or supposed to do. Cossacks take a centuries-old tradition of vigilante violence and unleash it on the Kremlin's enemies, like the banned Pussy Riot or the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who we'll talk about later. Now, creating fear is a tool of control, but look beyond fear for a moment, and instead look at the power of reconstituting tradition. Russia's GDP is the same as Spain's. Not exactly a country we consider a superpower. By appealing to tradition, you appeal to a time when Russia was stronger, was prouder, was more great, to a time when Russia was an empire. And by doing that, you begin to unite the population around a certain narrative. And you begin to tap into something that existed long before Putin came around, and that is the Russian collective identity. Let me just quote Alexander Dugin right now. Dugin is a philosopher and political theorist who probably more than anyone has helped provide the Kremlin its ideology. This is what Dugin says about collective identity and empire. He says, for us, empire or state, he makes no distinction between the two, is not artificial. It is not a construction on regional calculations. It is instead our breath, our skin. We understand empire existentially because it's naturally holistic. It is the very basis of our identity. As Americans, we tend to define our identity by our abilities, our freedoms, but Russian identity is much more about shared culture, shared language, shared history. And it always centered around patriotism, respect for the ruler, and the projection of power. So patriotism, we talked a little bit about, comes from recreating those shared traditions and shared religion. It also comes from the number one rule in the authoritarian's handbook, thou shalt have enemies. Enemy number one is, and will probably forever remain, the United States. Kremlin has created the narrative that everything wrong with Russia is the product of some kind of US plot to weaken the country. The narrative begins, as some of you may know, in the 1990s when the US supposedly humiliated Russia by expanding NATO to Russia's western borders, supported so-called color revolutions in previously pro-Soviet states and satellites, and it continued through 2011 and 2012 through massive protests that were supposedly organized personally by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Though there are also internal enemies. Those have included political opponents like Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated on a bridge a few hundred feet from the Kremlin. They include former members of the Putin inner circle who fled to places like Ukraine and the US, whose fate is often grisly. It includes groups whom you might call the enemy of the day. There have been Jews who have played that part in the past, and these days it's gay Russians. There's a woman named Masha Gessen who's a prolific writer and anti-Putin activist. This is how she describes it. The autocrat needs everybody out in the street with flags aloft, and everybody chanting their support for the leader. That's a society of mobilization. To have mobilization, you need enemies. Those enemies can change. You can have LGBT people one week, and then you can have Americans tomorrow. You can have Ukrainians the next time, and keep LGBT in your pocket. But what you're after is mobilization. And I would argue if you have mobilization, you don't need a puppet master. Putin does not need to, for example, as he is criticized for doing, ordering someone's death. It's much more Shakespearean than that, and much more like a mafia. How do you get made as a mob boss? Well, you're able to read the big boss and do his bidding for him without explicit instructions. If you think of it that way, you can understand why a mob boss might say, do I always really have to tell you what to do? Don't you know the right thing that there is to do? And it's what Gessen calls a desire emanating from the top, and people try and carry out that emanation. So you've created patriotism through religion, through culture, through tradition, and you've created fear. Then there's that second aspect of Russian identity, respect for the ruler. And I think this is a part that the United States often doesn't understand. Right now, it comes from a legitimate comparison of today's Russia to the 1990s. Post-Soviet years, as many of you remember, were brutal. The bread lines were long, the government was corrupt, the economy was fragile. Fast forward, and under Putin, the country stabilized. The economy might be a little stagnant today, but it's leap years ahead of what it was in the 1990s. And in that sense, Putin became the guardian of Russian stability. The guardian of Russian stability. And thanks to the religion and the traditions he helped create, he became the guarantor of Russian pride. This is not the stereotype of some evil puppet master. This is someone with a lot of strategy. And then that is enhanced by the third aspect of shared Russian identity. This is the projection of power. Putin began rebuilding the military in the late 2000s, but the real tripwire came in February 2014. Russian Special Operations Forces helped forcibly seize Crimea from Ukraine, rushed through a more than questionable vote in Crimea while I was there, and Russia's parliament annexed Crimea. It is impossible to overstate how transformative Crimea was to Russians and to Putin. After the annexation, suddenly his popularity spiked to nearly 90%. And it's important to understand why. So let me just explain Crimea for a second. Crimea is like, for Americans, if you're from the West Coast, if you combine the Pacific Coast Highway, or if you were from the Southeast, you take the Blue Ridge Mountains or the Great Lakes, if you're from the Midwest, if you combine that sense of awe and beauty with summer camp. For Russians, Crimea is not only beautiful and comes with a rich, fabled history, it's also the place where they took field trips when they were 12 and they had their first kiss. So many Russians actually say that, and that's what Crimea means to so many Russians. And of course, it was Soviet territory before that and part of the Russian Empire. So on the day of annexation, Putin gets up in front of the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament. And the men are waving and clapping, and the women are crying. And he gives this extraordinary speech combining everything that I've talked about: religion, imperial history, patriotism, and the projection of power. He said the West had been subjugating Russia, and that Russia was standing up for itself, finally, and demanding respect. And this is his quote: "If you compress the spring," that's Russia, "all the way to its limit, it will snap back hard. Russia is an independent, active participant in international affairs. Like other countries, it has its own national interests that need to be taken into account and respected." This is a man who believed that he had been humiliated and that he was no longer going to be humiliated, and he extended that to the entire country. After the annexation, Russians told pollsters they consider themselves a superpower again, something they hadn't felt since the 80s. Why? Because Russians for years had been told the United States was a superpower because it did what it wanted, where it wanted. And here suddenly was Russia doing what it wanted in its backyard. And you take that resurgent power and pride that Putin became the guardian of. You take that patriotism and you try and unite the population and convince them only a powerful state can protect them from enemies. Only a powerful state can protect you from enemies. Anyone who's studied authoritarian regimes that phrase will sound familiar. And in part, it is a product of Russian propaganda. And I can't tell this whole story without that. So let me explain a little bit about how that narrative gets created. In Russia, whoever controls the media controls the country. And there's one propagandist who stands head and shoulders above the others. His name is Dmitry Kiselyov. He's the anchor of the Sunday night news program on Russia 1, which is the most popular TV channel in Russia, and also it's state-owned. I would describe him as part Sean Hannity, part Stephen Colbert. He's entertaining and he's crass, and he is widely believed to reflect the Kremlin's thinking. So our best insight into the Kremlin is through Kiselyov's words, including these more choice quotes. 1, Russia is the only country in the world that is realistically capable of turning the United States into radioactive ash. Obama's like a eunuch. He can't do anything. He doesn't make anyone's blood run hot. Trump, on the other hand, is an alpha male. He could have put the blonde, that's Hillary Clinton, in prison, as he threatened in televised debates. On the other hand, this is nothing new. Trump has left blonde women satisfied all his life. It's the Sunday night news, folks. And more recently, the American press is driving Trump into a bullfight with no rules. The aim is impeachment, no pretext. It'll be created, invented, engineered, and exaggerated. So, this is what Kiselyov thinks, and we believe this is what the Kremlin thinks. Russian state media and the Soviets before it have long not only delivered the government perspective, but also tried to rally the public behind it. And they do so by replacing reality with a carefully crafted message. Sometimes that message is invented whole cloth. We found, when we were there, a couple of examples on Russian state TV where victims were actually played by actors or actresses. And we know they were actors because they showed up in totally unrelated stories as totally different people in totally different places. But usually, and this is important, and this is the connection to the first part of what I talked about, the message is not invented, usually. It always has a kernel of truth, and it's highly selective. And it's constantly massaged. So let's go back to Crimea. The message after Crimea was that Russia and Ukraine were attacked by gay fascist Americans. It worked for a little while, but not for very long. Then the message becomes, you know what, the West is crumbling. Nobody goes to church anymore. There are too many gays in Europe. There are too many refugees in Europe. The West has lost sight of its values and is dying. And that kind of worked for a little bit, but again, it ran its course. It's not really believable for a long period of time for Russians who have access to the West. And then came the third and most effective message. That message is, okay, so our elections, Russian elections, aren't great. And Russian police, maybe they're a little brutal and corrupt. And maybe our politicians are corrupt too. But look at Florida in 2000. Look at Ferguson. Look at the corruption revealed by the Panama Papers. There are no trustworthy elections anywhere. There are no good police anywhere. There are no politicians who aren't corrupt anywhere. So if the West is no better than Russia, if everyone everywhere is corrupt, if no authority is trustworthy, and if democracy does not exist, then the Russian system is more stable because our leadership is stronger. Our leadership, so goes the lines, projects power, guarantees our stability, and guards our pride. You will never have to go back to the 1990s again. So, that is the narrative. And you might say, well, if that's the narrative and it's all created by propaganda, then it's not real. And the only reason people believe it is deception and repression. Now, some would agree with that. Here's a critique from a man named Ilmi Umarov. He is a leader of the Tatars, which is a Muslim minority in Crimea. I visited him in April. He and other Tatars have fought the Russian annexation of Crimea, just like their grandfathers fought the Soviets for many years before them. To try and silence Ilmi Umarov, Russian authorities threw him into an insane asylum. He's not insane, nor has he been silenced. Here's his line this spring. All of this together we can call one big act of intimidation. The purpose is to silence some and keep others ignorant, to turn them into zombies so they think the same thing. In authoritarian regimes, these are the necessary conditions for the people to be loyal to their government. We cannot say this is a stupid population or stupid people. They are just living in a constellation of fear, and the propaganda machine rolls over them like a steamroller. So Umarov and many others may accuse Putin of manipulating the population, but this is my takeaway for this. Under Putin, Russia's revitalized the majority religion, brought back historic traditions, effectively projected power. There is no more chaos than the 1990s. Which is why when the West criticizes Putin, some Russians ask, why are you trying to weaken us? Why are you trying to take away our pride? So until there's a legitimate alternative, Putin will be considered the creator and will remain the caretaker of the new Russian identity. And perhaps that's why, or that helps explain why he acts like he does and why he remains popular. Which brings us to something I want to talk about for a few minutes, which is there any alternative? Is there a way for Russia to evolve? Is there a way for the US-Russia relationship to evolve so long as Putin is in charge? I was in Russia for nearly 2 months this spring, and something was happening that was unprecedented. A protest every weekend. Totally unheard of in the last few years. It was what I called Russia's season of discontent. Under Putin, there's been a tacit agreement that the people enjoy some economic liberalization, enjoy this new prosperity, and stay out of politics. Many Russians are now deciding that that bargain is no longer worth it. Their fear of the state is fading, and faith in themselves is rising. And what's helped them feel that way is a couple of things. In Moscow last year, the city administration put forward a plan to forcibly evict people from their homes. Evict them, move them to a different location, and construct new fancy high-rises in the old buildings that they currently live in, right along the Moscow River, beautiful real estate. If politics never touches you personally, you can keep your head down and keep on going. But if politics protrudes into your bedroom, literally, people get a little upset. And many previously apolitical people got upset and took to the streets. These are people like 38-year-old Alexei Kodorov. I met him at a protest in Moscow. He had never been a protester before. He'd never been an activist before. He doesn't even consider himself a protester or an activist, but he was being evicted and he didn't like it, so he took to the streets. And that's what he said. Well, I asked him, can he make a difference? He said, we can change things if we stay together. We need to stay active. It's very important right now to recreate civil society. For the last 5 years, civil society has almost disappeared. I would add it's been basically actively killed. Now is a very important moment. The people are starting to unite to show the government their point of view. He and many of the others I met at these protests have no proof that the plan to evict them is anything other than a way to improve real estate values. But they believe, they sense, they guess, that it's really about somebody in City Hall or somebody in administration who has connections to some builder. Somebody's making money, and that's the only reason they're being put through this. And it is that sense of corruption that has brought us to the current moment we are. And it has united tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people around one man, and his name is Alexei Navalny. He's a 41-year-old lawyer who started as an anti-corruption crusader. He has called Putin's party, which is called United Russia, the party of crooks and thieves. That's his most famous line. In March, years after he started, he posted his most famous and most successful video. So it was an expose about mansions, yachts, land that Navalny says were corruptly acquired by the prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev. One line from the video: Medvedev can steal so much and so openly because Putin does the same, but on a greater scale. The system is so rotten, there's nothing healthy left. Navalny uses YouTube because he has been shut out of Russian state media. And he can go straight to the people. And it's worked. That Medvedev video got 23 million views. And tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, we don't really even know the number, of people answered Navalny's call to protest in March and June. 180 cities, totally unprecedented in, frankly, the last century of Russian or Soviet history. The most widespread, unsanctioned protests we have seen in a long time, certainly in a generation. Now, Navalny's been convicted of a felony. He calls it a political conviction. And technically, that means that he can't run for president next year when elections are scheduled. But that hasn't stopped him from trying to seize on his momentum and actually hit the campaign trail. And he did, or he does, continue to hit the campaign trail, and I attended some of his rallies in the spring. And they kind of feel like, for any of you who've been involved in politics, they kind of feel like the early rallies in Iowa and New Hampshire. They're small, 40, 50, 60 people. Everybody gets their hand shaken by the candidate. And because most of the audience is very young, they all get selfies with Navalny. And in turn, he speaks their language. And if you could just imagine a small Russian room with, 40 or 50 20-somethings. And this is what he said in May. We do not owe the government anything. It is the government who owes us. They build an authoritarian regime that doesn't give anything back. They think we have no right to ask questions, that we have to shut up and listen. They tell us, F you, and we have to say, oh, okay, we're very sorry. But no, we have gathered here to say we're going to ask these questions and we'll obtain the answers. By the way, he didn't use F, he used the real word. Imagine an American politician talking like that. Now, when you ask these young people at these rallies about that new Russian identity that I was talking about the idea that Putin is the guardian of Russian stability, the guarantor of some kind of Russian pride, you realize they're not even old enough to remember the 1990s. They don't remember that there was chaos. What they see instead is corrupt and inefficient local governance that has failed to provide them, an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old or a 25-year-old, adequate streets, good academic institutions, and an economic system that actually inspires optimism and hope. So I'll quote 23-year-old Kirill Kozlovsky. In the 18 years that have passed since Putin came to power, he and his team could have done a lot more to help the situation, a lot more to make my life better. He didn't, so he's to blame. Very simple. My life isn't better. He's been in charge. I don't care what my grandmother says about the 1990s. To no surprise, the powers that be have not taken Navalny lying down. Volunteers have been arrested, charged with all sorts of things. The office manager in one of the cities I visited was charged with, quote, disseminating terrorist propaganda, and this is not a joke, for posting a John Oliver clip that made fun of ISIS. Navalny himself has been beaten up. Someone sprayed green antiseptic into his eye. He lost 80% of his vision in one eye. At public high schools, students have been forced to watch a video that depicts Navalny as Hitler. Now, Navalny's poll numbers remain low, but here's the thing. He is changing public opinion. 2/3 of Russians now identify corruption as the #1 problem. It was closer to number 10 just 1 year ago. And for the first time in a generation, young people are rejecting the government's talking points. On YouTube, you can find video from these classrooms where students challenge teachers who are trying to convince them that Navalny is Hitler. Now, Navalny's no saint. Many of his critics call him a nationalist, a nativist. 6 years ago, he released videos comparing immigrants who work in Russia to cockroaches. And he stands by the videos and says he wants to appeal to nationalists. Which is why, and here we come full circle, he does not criticize Putin's foreign policy. He focuses almost exclusively on corruption, because in a debate about foreign policy, frankly, Navalny will lose. Most Russians still believe that Putin has recreated a strong state, and they thank him for it. Navalny is simply trying to feed populism to an audience that's hungry and highlight government corruption to a generation who feel they have nothing to lose. There was a small glimmer of electoral hope yesterday. For those of you who follow Russian news, there was a coalition of liberal opposition parties, won 11 out of 12 Moscow city council seats. And the opposition called it Russia's most honest election ever. But this is a very small victory. City councilors will have some influence on next year's election for Moscow mayor, but otherwise they have little power. Moscow's always been the place where people opposed Putin. And elsewhere in the country, we saw what we usually see in these elections. United Russia won 16 of 16 votes for regional governors, and any candidates who were friendly to the opposition were shut off the ballots. So don't expect any major sweep into power for the opposition. And that is because, largely, if you're over 25, Navalny and anyone else is not a legitimate alternative. Putin remains the guardian of the state. And Putin will remain in power, no matter what the US does or no matter what most Russians do over the next years. And under that scenario, it seems difficult, if not impossible, that the relationship will improve. Not only are those deep ideological differences still there, not only do we have to deal with the legacy of 2016 and what the Russians are accused of doing in our elections, but now, I would add, because of the cloud that hangs over the Trump administration about Russia, there's not even any room for anyone who wants to improve the relationship with Russia to speak out publicly. Anyone who talks about common cause in Washington right now, about Russia over terrorism or nuclear weapons, is quickly accused of colluding with Russia to elect Donald Trump last year. And that's a shame, because I would argue it is vital long-term for the relationship to improve. So perhaps we should remember, and I'll end on Churchill's full quotation, the full thing. He was speaking on October the 1st, 1939 on the BBC. "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia, or the actions of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key, and that key is Russian national interest." And I think we have to all do a little better job at understanding that Russian national interest going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Got time for some questions. So everybody raise your hands right here. Bob, we'll start right here. And then Jim's right behind her.
One aspect of Putin remaining in power is this sort of Titus Andronicus aspect of eliminating people, either by poisoning them in London or taking their assets and putting them in jail. Will that continue, or will the protests, do you think, moderate that in a way?
Putin did not invent the fate of Russia's enemies ending up 6 feet under. The Soviets did that. Go back to Trotsky, and there have been. There was, I think, a case in London of a Bulgarian dissident being killed on Waterloo Bridge with a ricin-tipped umbrella in the 1970s. So no, he did not invent that, and it will not end with Putin. Now, we don't know who killed these people. We don't know who ordered these. But I'll just go back to one point I quickly made, which was that it's better not to think of Putin as some puppet master. It is better to think of the emanations, Shakespearean emanations, coming from the top. And that is that at times, it seems, the administration in Russia has decided that silencing someone is better than putting up with him. and that's not going to stop. What is interesting is why Navalny is not silenced, for example, and there are theories about that. And the conventional wisdom is that there are certain red lines you can and cannot cross. Alexei Navalny is allowed, so to speak, to call Putin corrupt. But there have been other activists and dissidents who tried to influence the Russian administration's pocketbooks to actually take money from them or access to the West, and they have been targeted. So if there is any rhyme or reason to who is targeted and who is not, that is one of the red lines. Also, if you are a former inner circle member and you leave that inner circle, then you really got to watch your back. But no, there's no sign of that ending. And again, it wasn't invented by Putin. It's a long history of that.
Question right there.
Thank you. Mr. Schifrin, thank you for coming. I've become a very loyal watcher of PBS NewsHour, and your interviews are fantastic. So,
thank you.
You're a star for the future, and we're glad to have you here. I also try to watch a lot of news now that I'm retired, and watched Oliver Stone's interviews with Putin on Showtime. And I must admit that he is extremely intelligent and extremely charismatic and has a very interesting counter view to what we have learned in our history over the past few decades.
That statement might apply to Oliver Stone and to Putin, but anyway.
Yeah, so, but yeah, I understand that he interviewed him in a very questionable way, et cetera. But nevertheless, until Putin dies, I don't think we're going to see much change. And who is next in line, and what did you think of the Oliver Stone show?
I'm gonna pass on the second question and do the first. I'm not here to disparage or praise those interviews. I've got more private thoughts which we can talk about afterward. But I will say this: it's actually an interesting question, right? That I only alluded to. Certainly for the short term, though, I think President Putin will remain president, and presumably he will run next year and get anywhere from, I don't know, between 70 and 110% of the vote. But there are very smart people, much smarter than me when it comes to Russia, who believe that he does not intend to rule forever. That his intention actually is to secure his legacy after this next election. And this is where we can bring it back to this country. There are a lot of people in the opposition who believe that what President Putin saw in President Trump was the opportunity to cement his own legacy, meaning Putin's own legacy. And there is an irony here, that Putin wants his legacy to be seizing Crimea back and having the international community accept that, increasing influence in the Middle East and having the international community cement that. He needs that second half. Otherwise, his legacy is questioned if Crimea is always in question, if Syria is always in question. And who is the only human being on the planet who can help deliver that cementing is the President of the United States. And so there was a belief among the opposition that Putin wanted Trump to be elected and wanted him there in order to cement his own legacy so that he could make sure that Crimea and Syria and some other regional things that he's been wanting to do got the stamp of approval by the United States. That is just not going to happen anymore for many reasons. So there's an argument to be said that he doesn't want power forever and that he is looking for some kind of grand bargain with the United States so he can step away. That part is speculation, so we don't know what he wants. But there's certainly some members of the opposition who believe that he wants one more election and try and figure out how to cement his legacy.
Got a question right up here.
What do you think Russia stands to gain by keeping the Middle East stirred up?
I think if I were Russian, I would answer that with all due respect, sir, you being America stirred it up and we're just coming in to fix it. I think we should understand Russia's intentions in Syria less necessarily. I'll get to the geopolitical aspect in a second. and more, as I vaguely alluded to, a projection of power. A lot of this is domestic politics. A lot of this is needing to project to his people what he is capable of and what Russia is capable of now. That said, there are very obvious needs that Russia has in Syria, and that is a port. It is its only Mediterranean access to the Mediterranean. That was in question if Assad had been allowed to fall. Also in question if Assad would have been allowed to fall is the continuing narrative that a people can rise up and overthrow its own government. And that is not something that he has any interest in allowing to happen in various places. So we could see it from here that things are still stirred up by Russian intervention, but I think it's important to understand that Russia needs Assad in some ways, both physically, geographically, and in an ideological way, and also he's trying to convince his people of a certain thing. He's not trying to keep things stirred up forever. He would actually, frankly, the Russian administration would probably happily leave Syria right now so long as it would be guaranteed access to the port and that Assad wasn't going anywhere, and that's where we might be headed. So they may have no interest in staying long term, actually.
Got a question right over here.
Could you talk a little bit about the similarities, if there are any, between Putin's political tactics and Donald Trump's political tactics?
Critics of the president, critics of President Trump, have argued that he exhibits tendencies toward an affinity for authoritarianism. Now, what these critics argue is that what does that mean? That means trying to use the media rather than respect its independence, trying to control the branches of state rather than work with the branches of state, and an approach to the world in which projection of power, shared traditions, is a better way to ensure stability than this messy experiment we call the democratic United States. I am not here to say whether that criticism is valid or not. I will just say that there is a lot of daylight between how the United States administration acts and the Russian administration acts. And even Putin's most fierce critics even President Trump's most fierce critics, those who knew Russia, would understand that there is a big difference between some of the things that we ascribe to Putin and some of the things we ascribe to President Trump. But there are those aspects of authoritarianism that the President Trump's critics accuse him of believing in or harboring. But all I'll just say is, the institutions in Washington are pretty robust compared to the institutions in Moscow.
Yes, we got a question right here.
What do you think Putin would like to see happen in North Korea?
I think it's a good question. Russia has a lot less influence on North Korea than perhaps Russia is claiming right now. North Korea has historically always been controlled by Beijing, Tokyo, and then whichever power it happens to be. So now, and for the last 70 years, it's been the United States. Russia would like to see stability. The last thing Russia wants to see is war. And China would say the same thing. They do not want to see war. War would be devastating for all of us in the United States, would be devastating for Japan, for South Korea, for anyone within 100 miles. So I think what his main incentive is, or what Russia's main incentive is, as well as China's, is avoiding war. And I think that the President Trump, his rhetoric about North Korea has changed some of the calculus in East Asia already, because generally, historically, when the President of the United States makes a threat, people take it very seriously, which is why the criticism of Obama not following through his threat about Syria was so fierce. And yet here we have a president who on Twitter will make lots of threats and then in person make lots of threats, and a lot of people believe they're already empty. So it's not clear how to take the American president's threats anymore. And that's not a criticism of Trump, it is simply, how does Moscow respond when the President of the United States make a threat? They just don't know anymore. So people are kind of navigating their way through that. But ultimately, the motivation largely from Moscow would be to avoid war and to do whatever it can to do that, while not allowing the United States to practice that hegemony, to practice that dominance that we talked about at the beginning.
In 2011, I spent about a month in Russia. And among the people I talked to were former soldiers. And that was when we were getting into Afghanistan in a big way. The Russian soldiers were glad to be out of Afghanistan. And they said the United States would have the same fate that they did. As we are talking about pulling out, Russia is about to go in again. Do you think they really will go in again?
No. Russia learned a lesson, and they're happy to watch us struggle in Afghanistan. Russia's not going in again. Russia's hedging bets. That's what U.S. commanders would say in Afghanistan. They've accused Russia of providing some arms to the Taliban, not in any meaningful way that could sway. Well, right, exactly, and we did the same. But you know, they're not providing the kinds of weapons that tipped the scale in Afghanistan that the CIA and the Pakistanis and the Saudis provided in the 80s. This is hedging bets. This is I think is important for the region about Afghanistan. This is less about Russia than about everyone. Nobody is convinced yet the United States will stay, and nobody is convinced the United States has found the formula to stabilize Afghanistan. So if that is the case, maybe there is no formula, right? If that is the case, then you can understand why Russia hedges its bets, why Pakistan, much more importantly, hedges its bets by keeping some of these really nasty guys on payroll or at least under control, why China would hedge its bets in Afghanistan. And that is largely, to simplify it, what I believe the region is doing, that until anyone is convinced that the U.S. has figured out a way to make Afghanistan a stable country, everyone's going to hedge bets and everyone's going to support not necessarily the U.S.'s enemies, but support whichever group might still come to power. And there are still a lot of people in the region who believe the U.S. will leave and the Taliban will take control back. So that's why you see people keeping connections open, maybe throwing some arms and weapons to the Taliban, not because Russia wants to be back in Afghanistan.
I know there are a lot more questions, and we're run out of time. So if you will please just come up and visit with Nick at the conclusion of this program. I want to say that you can see why it is such an engaging opportunity for the Clinton School students to have him here as a visiting fellow. He will be here throughout the school year at various times. And this afternoon at 3 o'clock in a quote, off the record quote session, he will be visiting with our students, an extraordinary opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Nick Schifrin.